Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Fractional DevRel podcast. My name is Jason Koo. I am your host today. And with me today I'm saying today a lot, I apologize. My special guest today is Marcos Placona. And he is I feel like one of the most prolific and best LinkedIn post folks out there around the subject of DevRel. Now, Marcos, you are the founder of DevRel Bridge. And you're also a co-author of a book, Developer Relations Ecosystem, was it?
How to build developer ecosystems. Yeah.
How to build developer ecosystem. Yes. Yeah. Such an easy title and I keep forgetting it. You co-wrote this book and it was released recently, I believed as well. And
yeah,
Marcus,
just last month. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Just that recently. Okay, perfect. We'll definitely put a link up there for folks to check out the book. And we'll circle back to that. And just to wrap up kind of a quick intro for you is you've been in developer relations for, I think, just a really long time, right? You were one of the head of developer relations over at Twilio, one of my favorite companies in terms of their DevRel strategies early on, and also Circle. So welcome to the show. So, your history goes for quite some time. What was your journey? What was your transition from an engineering development background?
Yeah. So I come from your kind of like traditional software engineer background. So I've always been a software engineer. Like I had my first computer when I was about 7, and I kind of like got interested in this. So I kind of like, from that age, I was lucky enough to know that I was going to grow up to do something related to computers because it's something that I liked from the very beginning. And was a software engineer for many years. I worked with Java, worked with .NET, and a lot of like JavaScript as well. But I've always been like a community type person. Okay. So, if you go and look at my sort of like background, I grew up in Brazil. I moved to the UK, so I live in the UK now, but I moved to the UK to study. And community was always something that was like really important to me because it was the place to go to find the people who liked and understood kind of like how my brain works, just like finding like-minded people. So like I was always kind of like involved in communities. And this was important to me because moving to the UK, I was like, okay, so I'm going to go and find what are the meetups in here and like where Java, back then it was Java. So where do Java developers go? And it kind of like continued like this. And one day someone came to me and said, hey, you seem like you enjoy kind of like doing conferences and everything. Like I see your name here and there. And back then I was an Android developer. So I was speaking at an Android conference. And I'm like, yeah. And they asked me, like, have you thought about developer relations? So this was 2013. Okay. And I was like, I don't even know what developer relations is. Like, this wasn't like a concept that existed in my head back then. And then they told me what it was. And I'm like, oh wait, that's a job. Like I'm kind of doing this for free now. So like, if you tell me it's a job, then it sounds really good. And from that moment, I kind of like started to look into developer relations. So I landed at Twilio in 2014. So like I kind of like, I started to pick which companies I wanted to kind of like get involved with. And Twilio was a company I was like very interested in. Okay. And like, to be honest, like back then, I didn't have much context on like how good the developer relations team at Twilio was. Okay, like, you mentioned that it's one of your favorite developer relations team. But like back then, I feel like I kind of like lucked out because I landed in a very good team. And I landed as an IC at Twilio. So I was, doing DevRel here in the UK. And then very quickly we decided to start growing DevRel outside of the UK because like DevRel for Twilio was very strong in the US, but not so much outside of the US. Now, also for context, back then Twilio was a 200-person startup. So joined Twilio, started to grow the team, started with EMEA, then moved on to helping grow the APAC team, and then the LATAM team. So I was at Twilio for 7 years. Okay, so from kind of like not knowing much about DevRel to actually leading the international DevRel teams at Twilio. So 7 years go by, and I'm like, okay, this is great, but it also, like, 7 years in startup world is like, like 20, 30, like it feels like a lot. So I left Twilio and went to work for Circle. At Circle, I was a global director of DevRel, and I was starting a team from nothing. Like, there was no team. So I was basically kind of like brought in to, start that team. Now, Circle was completely different to me because I knew nothing about crypto. I built Circle's team from the ground, like their DevRel team from the ground. And, 2 years go by, and I'm like, okay, I'm now kind of like getting this itch of working for a smaller company again. Okay, so remember, I joined Twilio when Twilio was like a 200-person company. It was very small. You knew everyone by name. And then, I left a 10,000-person company. I joined Circle the same way, where Circle was small, and then suddenly it was like over almost like 2,000 people, and pre-IPO as well. So I just felt this itch of like, I want to work with startups. And that's kind of like what got me to start DevRel Bridge, where like my focus is actually working with startups. So that's kind of like what my journey has been over this, I don't know, like this 12, 13 years that I've been doing this.
That's awesome. So when you first, there's so many different threads I could pull on here, but I'll just go on one before we go to our main topic, which is when you started over at Twilio, was there anything that you would say would best describe kind of what drove their success early on?
Yeah. And I think I can pinpoint to like one thing that was very, I think it's the one thing that kind of like made me pick Twilio, because again, when I started looking into DevRel, I was looking at different programs, and I knew exactly what programs I didn't want to work with. Okay, and the ones I didn't want to work with were the ones where I felt like being excited about the product was gonna feel like a drag. Okay, so like I'll give you an example, and it's no disrespect to them, because I actually love them as a company, and ultimately, serendipity kind of like brought us together. But when I was like considering Twilio, I was also considering SendGrid. Now, Twilio for me was very interesting because it actually interacts with your phone. Like, I'm now doing something and I'm making your phone ring. Okay, but not only there was magic in what the product did, Twilio from the very beginning, they knew that the way they were going to win was by winning the hearts and minds of developers. They knew this from the very beginning. And this to me was very refreshing, because a lot of the other companies I was talking to, they were like, oh yeah, we just need to bring more developers. Like we just want to kind of like, we want people to sign up, we want them to use the API and everything. But there wasn't really a why, which funnily enough, like, Twilio, one of Twilio's values, which I still remember, was start with why. Okay. And obviously there's books about this and everything, but like this for me was like, okay, so there is a purpose to all this. And I feel like where a lot of developer relations teams end up failing, like without going too much into what we're going to talk about today, is there is no why. There is no reason why they're doing this. And Twilio knew exactly what it is they wanted to do.
Nice. Yes. And so taking Twilio into account and Circle, and now your time at DevRel Bridge, to focus on our topic today, which is focusing on the difference between vanity metrics and how you move into pipeline. So because Twilio had this why, right? This focus of winning the hearts and minds of developers.
Yeah.
Did they also set like some, I would assume, some metrics that the team and the company aimed for? They
didn't. Okay. And like I joke about this, that if I were to go knowing what I know now, okay, and thinking the way I think, if I were to go work for Twilio again and they were still at that stage, I would probably say no. Okay, because also Twilio's program was very strong back then, but it was also one that is prone to failure today if they hadn't changed, which they have. Like I actually met with some like ex-colleagues from Twilio last week. I was at a conference, and we were like talking about metrics and everything. So obviously the mindset has changed, but if they kind of like carry that same mindset from back in 2014 into today, it's a program that like wouldn't have survived. Okay, because Twilio's sort of like mindset back then, and again, different times, different days, and kind of like different ways of thinking. The mindset was like, just be everywhere and be awesome. Okay, just go to places, go where developers go, and be awesome. There was never really any talk of, but we need to measure this. Like, but how is that going for the company? And I think the one thing for me when it comes to DevRel is like, there isn't one metric, okay? Like there isn't one thing or like one key metric that I can bring to every single company and say, if you do that, you're going to be successful. Like the one metric that DevRel should be following is the one that works for that company they're working for, okay? And in some companies, it might be, hey, the metric is how many people are successful with our docs, or how many people signed up, or how many people onboarded, how many SMS messages were sent. So like there isn't one single metric, but I think, back then again, talking about 2014, the reality is the focus was very much on, we just need to make sure that we are everywhere. Okay. And the focus was very much the awareness. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong because it works for Twilio. Okay, everyone knows Twilio and everyone knew Twilio back then. But I feel like in today's kind of like the macroeconomic environment where we live today, just the awareness wouldn't have cut it.
Okay. So you mentioned that different metrics for different companies are best for finding success for them individually. Do you have like a general framework or kind of a hit list that you go into with when you first meet a new company to try and figure out what their best metrics are?
Yeah. So I believe everything, and what I'll say here is like, like, you got to start from the very beginning, okay? And the very beginning is like, what is the first experience a developer has with your products? Like, whatever it is that you're trying to solve, or like whatever it is that you're offering. So like time to first success is something that I always try to push towards companies to begin with. As in, hey, if you're offering me your API, how long does it take me for me to be successful with it? Okay, and I had these clients that I worked with where we kind of like came to a conclusion that time to first success was 45 minutes. Okay, now 45 minutes is, again, like you mentioned this earlier, like the whole like what is the how much time are people willing to dedicate to something, to like doing something? And I feel like 45 minutes is like an acceptable time for like a lot of things. But as a developer who's kind of like finding, looking for different like different products or like different kind of like solutions, 45 minutes is time that I don't have. Because usually when I'm looking for a new solution, I'm doing this in the middle of a bunch of other things. Like, it's not a linear thing. There's a lot of things going on in parallel, and 45 minutes just feels like too much. So, long story short, with this client, we were able to kind of like shrink their time to first success to 5 minutes. And cutting 40 minutes is like, how do you cut 40 minutes without cutting corners? Or how do you cut 40 minutes without just making it too magical? Because the reality is, I can cut it down. Like I can cut an experience down to like 30 seconds if I give you a GitHub repository with all the keys, and all you need to do is like, git pull and run. Yes, but like, what was your experience here? Like, what have you done? So there's a whole lot of craft that goes into like, okay, what are the things that we can actually cut? And this is not just from a documentation perspective. Like, you need to kind of like look at the whole experience. Like, this may affect your product. This may affect like, what is the API key that your product actually needs in the very beginning? Can I generate your API key once you create an account? Also, do I need your zip code when you create an account? Probably not. So we managed to increase their kind of like, the number of people who stick around by 75%, which is huge because, you're basically saying like, out of 100 people who started this, 75 actually stick around. And they stick around and, they're now better customers for this company because like, not only they understand the products, they felt the aha moment. So that's kind of like, the sort of like magic that I try to do with a lot of my customers.
Nice. Are there any tactical tools or services you kind of go to first for helping people determine that time to value?
Yeah. So what I do is I do a friction log, what I call a friction log, which is basically I just go, my technique here is whenever I start a new conversation with a client, or with a potential client, I always like to know what it is they do, roughly. I never look at their API though. I don't do it, and I'll tell you why. I really like doing friction logs myself, okay? Like I really like kind of like going into the product and like learning the products and everything. But the only way I can do this in a very genuine way is if I know nothing about the product. So whenever I start a new engagement with a client, that is the first thing I do. Like whenever we say, okay, so it's all signs, we're gonna start, I do a friction log. And usually like from a friction log, I will, I feel like there are products, and I can think of many, but like I feel like there are products where you land on their docs page and very quickly you can do something. Like very quickly you feel like, okay, we've done something. With a lot of other products, like that's not the case. Like with a lot of other products, there's a lot of like, oh, okay, so now I need to get an API key, but also I need to get access to their sandbox. But to get access to their sandbox, I need to kind of like send an email to sales. So doing that first exercise, which usually, and I usually record this, okay? So I usually kind of like, I don't give a friction log to a client without actually giving them the evidence of like what the struggle is. But also the reality is like for a lot of my clients, they're so much into these products and they understand so much that they will never be able to do something that is kind of like as naive as what I can do because I haven't actually looked at the product.
Nice. So, okay. So a good metric then is time to value. Do you ever have clients who come in hard with like a set of metrics that you would categorize as vanity metrics?
Yeah, I have a lot of them because I think the reality is most people they will focus on the metrics that make them feel good, and like I don't think it's wrong. Okay, like I think it's kind of like it's human that you will focus on things that make you feel good. Like whenever you look at your X account and you see that it went from like 1,000 to 1,500, you're like, okay, there's another 500 people who want to listen to me up here. So that's kind of cool. And a lot of a lot of people building products, their focus is always going to be on like, how are we growing and how does it show? Like how is it perceived? So, I had a lot of situations where people came to me and said, hey, the work that we're looking for here is we're looking to grow GitHub stars, for example. And look, I'm not a hater of anything, okay? I feel like, GitHub stars, like, they're fine. Like, if you have a lot of GitHub stars, like, it does mean that you're successful with, like, whatever it is that you're doing. Like, people are finding it and they like it. But the reality is, I always try and make sure that people understand that, in the case of like some of the clients I work with, investors, they don't really care about GitHub stars. Okay, like, they don't, their mortgages aren't paid with GitHub stars. Like, their mortgages are paid with dollars, and if you're not making dollars, then GitHub stars, they don't necessarily map one to dollars. Okay, so no matter like how many stars you have, it may mean that people like you, but if they're not willing to pay you, or like if they're not willing to do the thing you want them to do, then that doesn't do much. So part of my job is actually explaining to people why some of those metrics are, they're okay. And I feel like whenever and again, like, because I work with a lot of other companies, like I'm very attuned to the space, but like whenever I kind of like tell something to a founder or like a product owner or something that maps with the dollars their products are making, they kind of understand what I mean. Okay, so like, if there's a lot of like vanity in there, if there's a lot of like, oh yeah, we just want to get followers or we just want to get stars, whenever I kind of like dig a little deeper, they go, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Like, stars are cool, but we need to get people to sign up, or we need to get people to convert. We need to work on our like onboarding experience, for example. So ultimately we get there. It's just that, again, as I think it's kind of like psychology, like, as humans, like we like things that makes us feel good. Okay. And like, stars makes us feel good, followers makes us feel good. But the reality is like, unless there's a strategy behind it, and unless they map to something, then, how long are those things going to make you feel good for?
So if you had to create a dashboard, so when you are providing these metrics or analysis to a client, how is that presented to a client, right? Is it like a report of some sort? Do you create a dashboard? How do you deliver this information?
Yeah, so I'm usually happy to use whatever tool that client is using. Okay, so if they're like, I'm not affiliated to them, but like I love PostHog. Like I feel like PostHog is like a wonderful tool and kind of like gives you everything that you need. Their MCP is also amazing, which is very helpful. Sometimes with certain clients, I first need to kind of like get them to measure things. Okay, so like I'm sure it's not going to be a surprise to you, but a lot of companies, they kind of like focus on building the thing, but not necessarily measuring whether the thing works. Or so in a lot of cases, like, before I actually start telling them about metrics, I need to kind of like get them to a point where there's some data from which we can get metrics from. Okay, and like, this is usually hey, we're gonna make a subscription for PostHog, and we're gonna start kind of like storing some data. If all you have is like Google Analytics, for example, it's fine. We can get some data from there, but we're not going to be able to be so granular. So usually I kind of like start from what do you have when it comes to data. And look, like some companies I work with, like they have data scientists and they basically have everything. Some companies have nothing. So it's kind of like, a way or another. So once they have the data, or like once they have sort of like the instrumentation in place, then I start by just showing them what is the data that I can gather that actually moves things. So for example, what do people do when they come to your docs? Like, do they bounce? Do they scroll? And I'm kind of like a data freak in this situation, because I like measuring everything. Like, for me, there may be data in there that I don't need, in which case I'll just kind of like skip it. But I want to know things like how far do people scroll on your pages, for example, like especially if it's in the docs, like, do they actually get to copy and paste your code? And if they copy and paste, you're now also thinking, does that code works? I like watching recordings as well. So like, in some cases I kind of like go to some of my clients with like, hey, here are like 6 recordings that I wanted to watch. And it's going to make you feel really uncomfortable, but it's also going to kind of like open your eyes about how good or how much your products can actually improve, just by people just being confused about what's going on. So I usually set up dashboards for clients. Like, whenever I leave, I like to make sure that they have everything they need to be successful. Now, I think it's also important that I caveat the whole like whenever I leave, because I the way I work with most of my clients is like I'm never really looking for a long-term engagement with anyone. Like I'm never really looking for like a long-term retainer, which funnily enough, Amir, who's my co-author on the book, he was like, Marcus, I don't think you're a very good consultant. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he goes, yeah, so Amir is a good friend of mine. So like he will tell me how it is. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he goes, well, because most consultants, they are consultants because they want to be with that company forever. Like they want to be on a retainer forever. And you always try and stipulate like a time. So there's always like a deadline. And I'm like, yes, because if I wanted to get a full-time job, I'd get a full-time job. Like, I don't necessarily want to be working with companies for like a very long time. So for me, there has to be a kind of like a deadline, because also I hate being in a situation where I'm making up work. So when I say like whenever I leave is like, usually on the sort of like anything between 3 to 6 month mark is when I kind of like start to make like slowly make my exit. And it's also at this point where I usually help my clients hire DevRel. So like I just finished one engagement now with a different company from New York who sort of like my exit was the transition between like me leaving and a new DevRel person, a new full-time person actually coming in. And what I try to do is like, I want to make sure that this person is like fully equipped to be successful at the job that they just got. So this means, they're going to have dashboards they can look at. They're going to have documentation they can look at. They'll get a good understanding of like, what is all the work that we've done over this like, 3 to 6 months. So they can all come in and they can almost kind of like hit the ground running.
That's a great handoff process, I think.
Yeah.
So do you prepare like a whole package and the whole training routine for this new person?
And in most cases, what I do is I actually spend time with them. So I try and make sure that at least my last month overlaps with their first month. Because like you got to think that my sort of like sweet spot clientele, they are anything between sort of like seed and series B. Okay, I work with bigger clients sometimes, but the reality is like the ones that I enjoy the most are the sort of like smaller companies. Like they're kind of like still figuring things out and everything. So for a lot of these companies, someone coming in, they will be, if I hadn't been there, they would be coming in as a founding DevRel, which is a horrible title. Like I hate the idea of like a founding DevRel. Okay, like I feel like it's a horrible title, and in most cases, someone who's a founding DevRel, they're basically mostly set up for failure. Okay, because it's gonna take them like 3 months to be successful. And at this point, a company who just hired a founding DevRel will be like, "Oh, you've been here for 3 months and you've done nothing."
Nice. To loop it back to kind of business value. So how that final gap, how do you determine which metrics are going to tie to sort of business dollars? Like how do you represent that? How do you show that to a client?
Yeah. So again, I basically sort of like my initial interview. So whenever I start a new engagement with a client, I do a series of interviews with like a bunch of different people in the business. And what I try to find at this stage is like, what do you actually care about? So like, you're a product person. So like, what do you care about? And what does success look like for you? And then you're a marketing person. What does success look like for you? So I try and find what are the common grounds in there. And then I try and find where are the places where I can influence the most by adding DevRel into the mix. So in some cases, it will be, a product who's saying, we need people using the product. Like, we built something cool, but like we don't actually have anyone using the product. And in this case, there will be things that I do like, Maybe it's an influencer campaign. Like I'm gonna go after some influencers to kind of help us out. Maybe it's a launch. Like maybe we actually need to go and launch. Like I had this client I was working with who they were great. Like they were great and they had a great product and everything, but they never really thought about actually marketing their product. Their mindset was very much like, we're going to build something so cool that people will discover and they'll be like in love with it and they'll use it. But the reality, and again, like it's a very kind of like engineering way of thinking about things, okay? And for this customer, we basically did like a full launch. Like this was, we're gonna do like a week of launch. We're gonna get some influencers. We're gonna make sure that we're on socials and everything. And this is this was a client I started to work with who, when I asked them, do you have an X account? They were like, no. And I'm like, okay, so like, we're gonna have to start from the very beginning here. And their launch was like massively pivotal for the company because now we had enough people kind of like going and telling other people how excited they were about the product. And, they got a lot of signups and everything. So for them, the focus was, we just want to get feedback from people and we just want to get signups. So that was kind of like the focus for them, okay? And everything that happens after is like, I'm always thinking, okay, so we're gonna get signups, and like, what happens when someone signs up? Like, do they get an email? And if they get an email, or if they sign up or don't do anything, like, is there a sequence? So these are all the things that I'm thinking of, okay? Like, what's gonna happen when someone signs up? So the metrics I come up with, they will vary a lot based on like what is the stage that you are as a company. Okay, like what is it that you need? But ultimately, what I try to do is like I will try and steer you away from anything that is like we want more stars. And I know I keep picking on stars. Like again, I don't hate stars. Okay, like it's fine. But I do try and steer people away because again, if I can't look at a metric and map it to like a dollar amount eventually, then that is not a good metric, okay? And again, I'm not trying to say like, you have to be a capitalist and you have to be thinking about people as like dollar amounts and everything. But the reality with like a lot of the companies I work with is like, there is a runway. That runway is in dollars, okay? And if they have a database with a bunch of people and those people aren't doing anything, they're only a cost, okay? And ultimately, no matter like how cool it is to have a database full of people, like if they're not doing anything, they're going to be a cost. You are gonna run out of your runway and you're gonna be out of business. So like some conversations I have with, and I mainly deal with founders, okay? Like I mainly deal with like startup founders, okay? But yeah, so to kind of like circle back on your question, it varies. Like what is the metric that I'm gonna focus on? But in a lot of cases, for me, it's going to be a metric that translates into dollars somehow.
Yeah, Marcus, for the audience members who want to follow in your footsteps and get to your level of independence and ability. Is there someone that you would recommend that they go and follow, whether it's a company or a person? Is there someone who's also a fountain of information like yourself that you would recommend them to?
Yeah, so I really like Zeno Rocha's content. So Zeno is the founder of Resend, and Zeno is someone that I met many years ago. Zeno, like funnily enough, Zeno is also from Brazil. That's not how we met, okay? But he's also from Brazil. He lives in the Bay Area, and he's the founder of CEO of Resend. Now, I met Zeno on his DevRel days before he was a founder. But I think the one thing that I really like about Zeno's content is he kind of mixes the whole developer experience with what is it like to run a company. Okay, like what is it like to being a CEO of a company who has funding and is raising rounds and everything. I really like reading his content because like he gets very real and sometimes very vulnerable, which is something that I think you have to be. Like if you're gonna be like a public person, and if you're gonna kind of like talk about what you're up to, you need to talk about your wins and your losses. And I feel like Zeno is kind of like that type person.
Oh, okay.
And it's also, we've interviewed Zeno for the book that we wrote. So he's also like, there's also a few like a few quotes from Zeno in the book.
Okay, so sounds like a very quotable guy then. Cool.
Yeah.
Marcos, if people want to get in touch with you or just follow along, what is the best way or the best place for them to follow you through?
I'm very active on LinkedIn. So I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. I like writing content there. And I feel like a lot of my best conversations, they like my best sort of like social media conversations, they end up happening on LinkedIn. But I'm also on X, like, for the people who don't like LinkedIn, I am Marcos Placona on both LinkedIn and X. So people will be able to find me on both of those. But yeah, that would be the place. Or like, just drop me an email as well if you want to. I'm happy to have conversations over email as well.
Cool. All right. I'll put all those links up for everyone. Cool. Awesome. All right. Thank you for your time, Marcos. Thank you everyone for watching, and we'll catch you at the next one. Bye.
Yeah.